Question 1. Topic: Judicial review of administrative actions. During a comprehensive review of a process that needs improvement, a federal agency issued a new rule significantly altering its prior regulatory stance. A group of affected businesses challenges the rule, arguing that the agency acted in arbitrary and capricious manner under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA). The agency asserts that it had broad discretion in policymaking and that courts should defer to its expertise. Which of the following best describes the standard of review a court should apply when evaluating the agency's action? A. The court should apply strict scrutiny, ensuring the agency's rule is narrowly tailored to achieve compelling governmental interest. B. The court should use the arbitrary and capricious standard under the APA, assessing whether the agency's decision was based on consideration of relevant factors and whether there was clear error of judgment. C. The court should automatically defer to the agency's rule under the Chevron doctrine as long as the agency has provided rational explanation. D. The court should determine whether the agency's decision is the best possible interpretation of the statute, substituting its judgment for the agency if necessary. Answer: B. The court should use the arbitrary and capricious standard under the APA, assessing whether the agency's decision was based on consideration of relevant factors and whether there was clear error of judgment. Explanation: under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA) SS 706, 2. A courts review agency actions under the arbitrary and capricious standard. This requires courts to evaluate whether the agency considered all relevant factors, failed to provide reasoned explanation, or made clear error in judgment. In Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Asand v. State Farm, 1983, the Supreme Court emphasized that agencies must provide rational connection between the facts found and the choices made. A. Incorrect. Strict scrutiny applies in constitutional law, not administrative rulemaking. C. Incorrect. While Chevron deference applies when interpreting statutes, the arbitrary and capricious standard applies when reviewing agency actions for reasonableness. D. Incorrect. Courts do not substitute their judgment for that of the agency, but instead assess whether the agency acted within legal bounds. Question 2. Topic: Procedural due process in administrative law. In a situation where formal requirements conflict with practical implementation, a state regulatory board revokes a business license due to non-compliance with safety regulations. The business owner was not given prior notice or an opportunity to respond before the revocation. The owner challenges this decision, arguing that the revocation violated procedural due process rights. What is the key legal test courts will apply to determine whether board's action violated due process? A. The rational basis test, assessing whether the board had legitimate reason for its decision. B. The Matthews v. Eldridge balancing test, weighing the private interest affected, the risk of erroneous deprivation, and the government's interest. C. The non-delegation doctrine, ensuring that the board did not exceed its delegated authority. D. The Chevron two-step framework, evaluating whether the board's interpretation of safety regulations was reasonable. Answer: B. The Matthews v. Eldridge balancing test, weighing the private interest affected, the risk of erroneous deprivation, and the government's interest. Explanation: the Matthews v. Eldridge 1976 test is the standard for determining procedural due process violations. Courts balance three factors. The private interest affected. In this case, the business owner's license's substantial interest tied to livelihood. The risk of erroneous deprivation and the value of additional procedures, and the lack of prior notice and hearing increases the likelihood of an unjust revocation. The government's interest, including administrative efficiency. State has an interest in public safety, but must also ensure fairness. A. Incorrect. Rational basis applies to substantive due process, not procedural due process. C. Incorrect. The non-delegation doctrine applies to improper delegation of legislative power, not due process issues. D. Incorrect. Chevron deference governs statutory interpretation, not procedural due process. Question 3. Topic: Public participation and transparency in administrative law. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in regulatory decision-making, a government agency issues a policy directive without public input, citing time sensitivity. A citizens' advocacy group files lawsuit, arguing that the agency failed to comply with public participation requirements under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA). following conditions would most likely allow the agency to bypass public notice and comment rulemaking under past Section 553A. The agency labeled the directive as an interim final rule subject to later review. B. The directive falls under the good cause exemption where notice and comment is impractical, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. C. The agency determined that public input was not required because the directive was issued by a high-ranking official. D. The rule concerns significant policy matter and the agency believed public comments would not alter the final decision. Answer. B. The directive falls under the good cause exemption where notice and comment is impractical, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. Explanation. Under ISS 553 B. Agencies may forego notice and comment rulemaking if they establish a good cause, meaning public participation would be impractical, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. Courts, however, interpret this exemption narrowly to prohibit. In United States v. Nova Scotia Food Products Corp. 1977, the court invalidated an agency action for improperly bypassing notice and comment, emphasizing the importance of transparency. A. Incorrect. Labeling rule as an interim final rule does not automatically exempt it from APA procedures unless it qualifies under the good cause exemption. C. Incorrect. Rulemaking procedures apply regardless of which official issues the directive. D. Incorrect. The agency's belief that comments wouldn't change the outcome does not justify skipping public participation. Question 4. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in administrative rulemaking, a regulatory agency is facing increasing legal challenges over its recent regulations. The agency had implemented a new rule under informal rulemaking procedures pursuant to APA Section 553, but was later sued by an industry group claiming that the rule should have gone through formal rulemaking instead. The plaintiffs argue agencies' reliance on notice and comment procedures was insufficient due to the rule's significant economic impact. Additionally, they claimed that the agency failed to adequately respond to substantial public comments, violating procedural due process principles. Given these facts, which of the following is the most legally sound response regarding the agency's compliance with administrative law principles? A. The agency acted properly under APA Section 553, as most regulations follow informal rulemaking and the economic impact of rule does not itself require formal rulemaking. B. The plaintiffs are correct that the agency should have followed formal rulemaking because any rule with major economic impact is subject to heightened procedural protections. C. The agency's failure to respond meaningfully to substantial public is violation of the Administrative Procedure Act APA, making the rule subject to judicial invalidation. D. Since the agency did not grant an oral hearing to affected parties, it violated procedural due process, rendering the rule unenforceable. Answer. C. The agency's failure to respond meaningfully to substantial public comments is violation of the Administrative Procedure Act APA, making the rule subject to judicial invalidation. Explanation. Under APA Section 553, most rules are promulgated through informal rulemaking, which involves notice and comment procedures. Formal rulemaking, requiring an on-the-record hearing, is only mandated if the enabling statute explicitly requires it, which is rare. Thus, the agency is not required to engage in formal rulemaking merely because of rules' economic significance, eliminating option B. However, an agency must meaningfully consider and respond to significant comments submitted during the notice and comment process. Courts have held that failure to do so constitutes arbitrary and capricious agency action, violating the APA. See Motor Vehicle MRS. E. State Farm Auto Ins. Company 463 U.S. 29, 1983. Therefore, the rule is vulnerable to judicial invalidation, making C the correct choice. Option A is incorrect because, although informal rulemaking is generally sufficient, agencies must still adhere to procedural requirements, including properly considering comments. Option D is incorrect because procedural due process typically requires hearings only when individual rights or property interests are at stake, such as in adjudications. Matthews v. Eldridge 424 U.S. 319, 1976. Here, rulemaking applies broadly and does not require an individual hearing. Question 5. During an emergency response where multiple areas are impacted, a state administrative agency issues a temporary rule bypassing normal notice and comment procedures. The agency argues that compliance with APA Section 553 is impractical due to an urgent need to prevent public harm. However, a group of affected businesses sues, claiming that the emergency rule is invalid due to lack of public participation. Following is the most accurate legal assessment. A. The agency's rule is likely valid under the good cause exemption of a Part Section 553, B3, B, which allows agencies to bypass normal procedures when notice and comment would be impractical or contrary to the public interest. B. The rule is automatically invalid because no administrative rule can be enacted without public participation, regardless of emergency conditions. C. The businesses are correct because due process requires all affected parties to be heard before rule can take effect, regardless of the circumstances. D. The agency must at least provide post-enactment public hearing before enforcing the rule to comply with due process requirements. Answer A. The agency's rule is likely valid under the good cause exemption of a Part Section 553, B3b, which allows agencies to bypass normal procedures when notice and comment would be impractical or contrary to the public interest. Explanation: under a Part Section 553, B3b, agencies may bypass the normal notice and comment process under the good cause exemption if they can demonstrate following these procedures would be impractical, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. This applies particularly in emergency situations where immediate action is required to prevent harm. See Giffrey v. Fott 370 F.3-1174 D.C. Sir. 2004. Option B is incorrect because administrative law does allow emergency rulemaking when justified. Option C is incorrect because procedural due process does not always require pre-enactment hearings for broad policy rules. Matthews v. Eldridge 1976 established balancing test where the government's interest in swift action can outweigh procedural burdens. Option D is incorrect because while some emergency rules are later subjected to public input, post-enactment hearing is not an absolute requirement under APA emergency provisions. Question 6. In a situation where formal requirements conflict with agency discretion, a federal regulatory agency denies an application for a business license, citing broad discretionary authority granted by statute. The affected business challenges the denial in federal court, arguing that the agency's decision is arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedure Act, APA, Section 706(2)(a). Which of the legal principles best applies? A. The agency's decision is likely valid if it is based on reasonable interpretation of the statute and follows established agency precedent. B. The business is correct because agencies must justify their decisions with clear and convincing evidence or else the denial is unlawful. C. The agency must always hold full trial-like hearing before denying any application or else the denial violates procedural due process. D. The business can challenge the decision in court because agency discretion is absolute and not subject to judicial review. Answer A. The agency's decision is likely valid if it is based on reasonable interpretation of the statute and follows established agency precedent. Explanation: under APA, Section 706(2)(a), courts may set aside agency actions if they are arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion or otherwise not in accordance with the law. However, agencies have broad discretion in decision-making as long as their actions are reasonable, supported by the record, and consistent with statutory authority. Courts often defer to agencies under Chevron U.S.A. Inc. v. Natural Resources Defense Council 467 U.S. 837 1984 when statutes are ambiguous. Option B is incorrect because agencies do not need to meet clear and convincing evidence standard for discretionary decisions unless the statute requires it. Instead, they must show reasoned decision-making supported by the record. Option C is incorrect because procedural due process only mandates hearings in adjudications where individual rights are at stake. General licensing decisions often do not require trial-like hearings. Option D is incorrect because while agency discretion is broad, courts retain the power of judicial review to ensure that discretion is exercised lawfully. Question 7. Given the complexities of overlapping federal and state regulations, a state agency issues a rule that conflicts with a pre-existing federal regulation. The federal agency responsible for the area asserts that its rule preempts the state regulation under the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution. However, the state argues that its rule should stand because it provides greater consumer protections than the federal counterpart. Which of the following best describes the legal principles governing this situation? A. The federal rule automatically overrides the state rule under express preemption, making the state rule invalid. B. The state rule remains valid unless it directly contradicts federal law or frustrates the purpose of the federal regulation. C. State rules always take precedence over federal rules when they offer greater consumer protections. D. The agency must seek a judicial ruling before enforcing either rule. Answer: B. The state rule remains valid unless it directly contradicts federal law or frustrates the purpose of the federal regulation. Explanation: under the Supremacy Clause, Article Omens Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution, federal law preempts conflicting state law. However, preemption applies in different ways. Express preemption occurs when Congress explicitly states that federal law overrides state law. Option A is incorrect because federal laws do not always automatically override state laws unless explicitly stated. Implied preemption includes conflict preemption where state law contradicts federal law, and field preemption where regulation is so comprehensive that it leaves no room for state regulation. However, when state law provides greater protections without conflicting with federal law, courts often allow it to stand. Wyeth v. Levine, 555 U.S. 555, 2009. Thus, option B is correct because unless the state rule directly contradicts or frustrates federal objectives, it may coexist. Option C is incorrect because the mere fact that a state rule offers more consumer protections does not automatically make it valid if it contradicts federal law. Option D is incorrect because preemption analysis does not always require a court ruling before enforcement. Administrative agencies can determine preemption but are subject to judicial review. Question 8. While evaluating a new regulatory framework, a federal agency receives thousands of public comments. Several industry groups later sue, arguing that the agency failed to properly consider economic impacts when finalizing the rule. The agency, in turn, asserts that it has broad discretion under Chevron deference to interpret its enabling statute. Which of the following best describes the agency's legal standing? A. The agency is likely to prevail because under Chevron deference, courts must defer to reasonable agency interpretations of ambiguous statutes. B. The industry groups will likely succeed because the agency is required to conduct full economic impact analysis before issuing any rule. C. The lawsuit will succeed if the agency's rule is deemed arbitrary and capricious under APA Section 706 2A. D. Courts must strike down agency rules that impose significant economic burdens on businesses. Answer: C. The lawsuit will succeed if the agency's rule is deemed arbitrary and capricious under APA Section 706 2A. Explanation: under Chevron U.S. stating the ADC 467 U.S. 837, 1984 courts apply a two-step test to determine whether an agency's interpretation of a statute is permissible. Step 1. If Congress has directly spoken on the issue that interpretation governs. Step 2. If the statute is ambiguous, the agency's interpretation is valid as long as it is reasonable. However, Chevron deference does not shield agencies from judicial review under the arbitrary and capricious standard in APA Section 706 2A. If the agency failed to consider key economic impacts or ignored relevant data, the rule may be invalidated. Motor Vehicle MRS. Asand v. State Farm 463 U.S. 29, 1983. Thus, option C is correct because courts may strike down rules that are arbitrary or unsupported by evidence. Option A is incorrect because Chevron deference applies to statutory interpretation, not necessarily economic impact analyses. Option B is incorrect because agencies are not always required to conduct full economic analysis unless mandated by statute. Executive Order 12866 requires cost-benefit analyses for major rules, but not all rules. Option D is incorrect because courts do not strike down all rules that impose economic burdens. They only intervene if the rulemaking process was procedurally flawed. Question 9. In a scenario where competing interests challenge an agency's rule, the agency justifies its decision by citing policy considerations rather than explicit statutory text. Court reviewing the challenge applies Skidmore deference instead of Chevron deference in its analysis. What does this indicate about the court's reasoning? A. The agency's interpretation lacks the force of law, so the court only considers it for its persuasiveness rather than granting binding deference. B. The court views the agency's interpretation as controlling because agencies always receive deference in their area of expertise. C. The agency's rule is automatically invalid since policy-based justifications are not allowed. D. The court must disregard the agency's interpretation completely. Skidmore deference only applies to formal rulemaking. Answer. A. The agency's interpretation lacks the force of law, so the court only considers it for its persuasiveness rather than granting binding deference. Explanation. Under Skidmore v. Swift and Company 323 U.S. 134, 1944, courts grant Skidmore deference when an agency's interpretation lacks the force of law, e.g., guidance documents, policy statements, opinion letters. This means courts consider the agency's expertise and reasoning but are not bound by its interpretation. Thus, option A is correct because Skidmore deference means courts weigh an agency's position for its persuasiveness, rather than granting deference as under Chevron. Option B is incorrect because agencies do not always receive deference. Under Skidmore, the court makes an independent judgment. Option C is incorrect because policy considerations can be relevant but they do not override statutory text. Option D is incorrect because Skidmore deference applies to both formal and informal interpretations, including agency guidance and policy statements. Question 10. Given the increasing reliance on administrative agencies to interpret and enforce federal laws, a newly established agency drafts a rule that expands the scope of an existing statute beyond its original text. A business organization challenges this rule, arguing that the agency has exceeded its authority. The agency responds by citing its broad regulatory powers under its enabling statute. Which legal doctrine would the most likely apply to determine whether the agency has overstepped its boundaries? A. The major questions doctrine, which requires clear congressional authorization for agency actions of vast economic and political significance. B. Chevron deference, under which courts defer to reasonable agency interpretations of ambiguous statutes. C. The non-delegation doctrine, which prohibits Congress from granting regulatory agencies broad discretionary powers. D. Preemption doctrine, which determines whether federal law overrides state regulations. Answer. A. The major questions doctrine, which requires clear congressional authorization for agency actions of vast economic and political significance. Explanation. Under the major questions doctrine, courts require clear congressional authorization when agencies take actions with significant economic or political consequences. The Supreme Court applied this principle in West Virginia v. EPA 2022, ruling that agencies cannot claim broad regulatory powers unless Congress explicitly grants them. Thus, option A is correct because courts would assess whether Congress clearly authorized the agency's expansion of statutory authority. Option B is incorrect because Chevron deference applies only when statute is ambiguous. It does not allow agencies to create entirely new powers beyond what Congress intended. Option C is incorrect because while the non-delegation doctrine limits excessive delegation of legislative power, it is rarely invoked to strike down laws. Option D is incorrect because preemption doctrine governs conflicts between federal and state law, not agency rulemaking. Question 11. While evaluating agency rulemaking authority, a court applies the arbitrary and capricious standard under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA). Which of the following would most likely cause a court to invalidate the agency's rule? A. The agency failed to consider relevant evidence before finalizing the rule. B. The rule resulted in economic burdens on businesses, even though it complied with statutory requirements. C. The agency's interpretation differed from prior policies, even though it explained its reasoning. D. The rule was criticized during the public comment period, but the agency responded to concerns. Answer. A. The agency failed to consider relevant evidence before finalizing the rule. Explanation. The Administrative Procedure Act (APA) 5 U.S.C. SS 706(2)(a) requires courts to strike down agency rules if they are arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion, or otherwise not in accordance with law. Rule is considered arbitrary and capricious if the agency failed to examine relevant data, ignored important policy concerns, provided an explanation that runs counter to evidence, Thus, option A is correct because courts often invalidate rules when agencies fail. Properly consider all relevant factors. Motor Vehicle MRS. Asand v. State Farm 463 U.S. 29, 1983. Option B is incorrect because economic burdens alone do not invalidate rule if the agency followed proper procedures. Option C is incorrect because agencies can change policies as long as they provide reasoned explanation. FCCV. Fox Television Stations 556 U.S. 502, 2009. Option D is incorrect because agencies are not required to agree with public comments. They only need to consider and respond to them. Question 12. Given the balance between individual privacy and national security, a federal agency expands its surveillance authority through administrative rulemaking. Civil rights groups challenge the rule, arguing it violates constitutional protections. Which legal standard is most relevant for determining whether the agency's rule is valid? A. The Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. B. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. C. The Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. D. The 10th Amendment, which reserves powers to the states. Answer A. The Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Explanation. The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures, making it the most relevant standard in challenges to government surveillance programs. Courts assess whether the expectation of privacy was violated, whether the government had proper legal justification, e.g. a warrant. Thus, option A is correct because surveillance expansion may violate Fourth Amendment rights. Carpenter v. United States 138 S. CT 2206-2018. Option B is incorrect because the Equal Protection Clause applies to discrimination claims, not privacy rights. Option C is incorrect because the Due Process Clause generally applies to fair procedures, not privacy from government surveillance. Option D is incorrect because the 10th Amendment concerns state versus federal power, not constitutional rights of individuals. Question 13. While implementing environmental regulations, a federal agency issues new emissions limits based on evolving scientific data. A group of manufacturers challenged the limits, arguing that the agency failed to consider economic feasibility. How would a court most likely assess this claim? A. By applying the arbitrary and capricious standard to determine if the agency properly considered all relevant factors. B. By requiring the agency to provide absolute certainty in its scientific findings. C. By invalidating the rule because agencies cannot rely on evolving scientific data. D. By deferring to the agency's expertise without judicial review. Answer A. By applying the arbitrary and capricious standard to determine if the agency properly considered all relevant factors. Explanation. When agencies rely on scientific data, courts apply the arbitrary and capricious standard to assess whether they considered all relevant factors, provided a reasonable explanation for their decision. Thus, option A is correct because courts ensure agencies properly weigh economic feasibility but do not require agencies to prioritize it over public health. Option B is incorrect because scientific certainty is not required. Courts recognize agencies' work with evolving data. Baltimore Gas and Electric Company v. ADC 462 U.S. 87, 1983. Option C is incorrect because agencies can rely on new scientific findings to update regulations. Option D is incorrect because courts always retain the power to review agency actions. Question 14. Given the ongoing challenges of balancing economic growth and environmental sustainability, Congress delegates broad regulatory authority to a federal agency. The agency enacts new policies that impose stricter pollution limits. A coalition of industries challenges these limits, arguing that the agency's actions exceed the authority granted by Congress. Which of the following principles will most likely guide the court's review? A. The Major Questions Doctrine, requiring explicit congressional authorization for regulations with significant economic impact. B. Chevron deference, allowing the agency to interpret ambiguous statutory provisions. C. The Commerce Clause, which governs congressional power over interstate commerce. D. The 10th Amendment, which protects states' rights from federal overreach. Answer A. The Major Questions Doctrine, requiring explicit congressional authorization for regulations with significant economic impact. Explanation. The Major Questions Doctrine requires that agencies have clear congressional authorization when enacting regulations with substantial economic and political consequences. Courts apply this doctrine to prevent agencies from assuming too much power without explicit approval from Congress. Westwood v. EPA 2022. Thus, option A is correct because courts would assess whether Congress clearly authorized the agency's strict pollution limits. Option B is incorrect because Chevron deference applies to ambiguities within statutes, but it does not allow agencies to create significant new powers. Option C is incorrect because the Commerce Clause concerns Congress's authority over economic activity, not agency overreach. Option D is incorrect because the 10th Amendment applies to state versus federal power disputes, not federal agency authority. Question 15. While reviewing administrative regulations, a federal court applies the two-step framework established in Chevron U.S. Inc. v. Natural Resources, Defense Counsel, 1984. Which of the following best describes the two-step analysis? A. Step 1. Determine whether Congress has spoken clearly on the issue. Step 2. If the statute is ambiguous, defer to the agency's reasonable interpretation. B. Step 1. Assess whether the regulation imposes excessive economic burdens. Step 2. If so, invalidate the rule. C. Step 1. Determine if the agency consulted with stakeholders. Step 2. If not, require further review. D. Step 1. Determine if the agency followed public procedures. Step 2. If it did, uphold the rule. Answer A. Step 1. Determine whether Congress has spoken clearly on the issue. Step 2. If the statute is ambiguous, defer to the agency's reasonable interpretation. Explanation. The Chevron framework consists of two steps. Step 1. Determine whether Congress has spoken directly and clearly on the issue. If so, the agency must follow Congress's intent. Step 2. If the statute is ambiguous, courts defer to the agency's reasonable interpretation. Option A is correct because it accurately reflects Chevron deference. Option B is incorrect because economic burdens alone do not determine rules' validity. Option C is incorrect because while stakeholder input is important, it is not part of Chevron's legal test. Option D is incorrect because public comment compliance does not automatically validate rule. Question 16. Given the rise of artificial intelligence in regulatory decision-making, a federal agency develops an AI system to process applications for government benefits. A denied applicant challenges the decision, arguing that reliance on AI violated their due process rights. Which constitutional principle is most relevant to this claim? A. The Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, requiring fair procedures. B. The Separation of Powers Doctrine, limiting agency authority. C. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, prohibiting discrimination. D. The 10th Amendment, preserving state authority. Answer A. The Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, requiring fair procedures. Explanation. The Due Process Clause, Fifth Amendment, guarantees individuals fair procedures when the government makes decisions affecting their rights. If an AI system improperly denies benefits without human oversight, courts may find a due process violation. In Goldberg v. Kelly, 1970, the Supreme Court ruled that applicants for government benefit must have an opportunity to challenge denials. Thus, option A is correct because the applicant has a right to due process when the government denies benefits. Option B is incorrect because separation of powers applies to branches of government, not agency decision-making. Option C is incorrect because equal protection concerns discrimination, not procedural fairness. Option D is incorrect because the 10th Amendment concerns state versus federal power disputes, not individual rights. Question 17. Given the complexities of interagency coordination, a dispute arises between two federal agencies over regulatory jurisdiction. Which of the following legal principles will most likely be used to resolve the conflict? A. The Chevron doctrine, deferring to one agency's interpretation. B. The Administrative Procedure Act, APA, which provides procedures for resolving disputes. C. Executive orders, which grant the President authority to resolve conflicts. D. Preemption doctrine, determining whether federal law overrides state law. Answer B. The Administrative Procedure Act, APA, which provides procedures for resolving disputes. Explanation. The Administrative Procedure Act, APA, establishes procedures for resolving interagency disputes. Agencies may use negotiated rulemaking, seek clarification from Congress or courts, follow dispute resolution processes outlined in their enabling statutes. Thus, option B is correct because the APA governs administrative conflicts. Option A is incorrect because Chevron deference applies to statutory interpretation, not interagency disputes. Option C is incorrect because while executive orders can influence agencies, they do not automatically resolve jurisdictional disputes. Option D is incorrect because preemption doctrine applies to state versus federal conflicts, not disputes between federal agencies. Question 18. Given the increasing role of independent agencies in regulatory enforcement, Congress passes a law limiting the president's authority to remove the head of an independent agency. The president challenges the law, arguing that it violates the Constitution's separation of powers. Which Supreme Court case is most relevant? A. Sealer Law LLC v. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau 2020. B. Chevron U.S. Inc. v. IDC 1984. C. Marbury v. Madison 1803. D. Yun Sound Sheet and Tube Company v. Sawyer 1952. Answer A. Sealer Law LLC v. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau 2020. Explanation. In Sealer Law LLC CAB 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress cannot unduly restrict the president's ability to remove executive officials. The case held that single director independent agencies violate the separation of powers when they are insulated from presidential control. Thus, option A is correct because it directly addresses removal restrictions on independent agency heads. Option B is incorrect because Chevron concerns agency statutory interpretation, not executive power. Option C is incorrect because Marbury v. Madison established judicial review, not agency independence. Option D is incorrect because Yun Sound limited presidential wartime powers, not removal authority. Question 19. Given the ongoing advancements in financial technology, Congress enacts a law expanding regulatory oversight of digital currencies. A cryptocurrency exchange challenges the new regulations, arguing that they exceed the authority delegated to the agency. Which of the following legal doctrines will most likely determine whether the regulations are valid? A. The Chevron doctrine, deferring to agency interpretation if the law is ambiguous. B. The non-delegation doctrine, which limits Congress's ability to transfer its legislative power. C. The Commerce Clause, allowing Congress to regulate interstate economic activity. D. The Supremacy Clause, which resolves conflicts between federal and state laws. Answer. B. The non-delegation doctrine, which limits Congress's ability to transfer its legislative power. Explanation. The non-delegation doctrine restricts Congress from granting excessive legislative power to agencies without clear guidance. If Congress delegates overly broad authority without defining standards or limits, the courts may rule the delegation unconstitutional. In J. W. Hampton Union Company v. United States 1928, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress must provide an intelligible principle when delegating power. In Gundy v. United States 2019, the court upheld broad delegation but suggested future shift towards stricter non-delegation limits. Thus, option B is correct because if the law fails to provide clear guidance, it may violate the non-delegation doctrine. Option A is incorrect because Chevron deference applies to agency interpretation of ambiguous statutes, but does not override constitutional limits on delegation. Option C is incorrect because while the Commerce Clause justifies Congress's ability to regulate digital currencies, it does not resolve agency overreach. Option D is incorrect because the Supremacy Clause applies to conflicts between federal and state law, not agency authority. Question 20. Given the rise of artificial intelligence in government decision-making, Congress enacts a statute requiring agencies to disclose when AI is used in regulatory enforcement actions. An agency fails to disclose its reliance on AI when imposing penalties on a company. The company challenges the decision in court. Which of the following is the most likely outcome? A. The agency's action is upheld if it followed general procedural requirements. B. The court invalidates the agency's action for violating procedural due process. C. The case is dismissed because the company must prove actual harm from AI use. D. The challenge is rejected because agencies have broad discretion in enforcement. Answer. B. The court invalidates the agency's action for violating procedural due process. Explanation. Due process requires transparency when the government makes decisions affecting rights or penalties. Courts have recognized that undisclosed use of AI may violate procedural due process if it denies individuals fair notice and opportunity to challenge decisions. In Goldberg v. Kelly 1970, the court ruled that due requires individuals to know and challenge government actions affecting their rights. If an agency fails to disclose AI uses required by law, courts may invalidate the decision. Thus, option B is correct because non-disclosure violates procedural due process. Option A is incorrect because procedural compliance alone does not excuse failure to follow legal disclosure requirements. Option C is incorrect because courts do not always require proof of harm to find due process violations. Option D is incorrect because agency discretion does not override legal requirements for transparency. Question 21. Given the increasing complexity of modern financial markets, Congress delegates new enforcement powers to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. A financial institution challenges the SEC's new regulations, arguing that they impose excessive economic burdens. Which legal standard will courts most likely apply? A. The arbitrary and capricious test, assessing whether the regulations are reasonable. B. The strict scrutiny test, requiring compelling government interest. C. The substantial burden test, determining if the regulations unduly harm businesses. D. The necessary and proper clause, justifying federal regulatory power. Answer: A. The arbitrary and capricious test, assessing whether the regulations are reasonable. Explanation: under the Administrative Procedure Act, agency actions must not be arbitrary, capricious, or an abuse of discretion. Courts apply this standard when reviewing challenges to agency regulations. In Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Association v. State Farm, 1983, the Supreme Court ruled that agencies must provide explanations for regulations. If the SEC's regulations lack reasoned basis, they may be struck down. Thus, option A is correct because courts apply the arbitrary and capricious test to review agency rules. Option B is incorrect because strict scrutiny applies to constitutional rights, not agency regulations. Option C is incorrect because courts do not apply general, substantial burden test to agency rules. Option D is incorrect because while the necessary and proper clause justifies federal laws, it is not used to evaluate regulations. Question 22. Given the evolving role of administrative adjudication, Congress authorizes agencies to impose civil penalties without a jury trial. A company challenges this practice, arguing that it violates the Seventh Amendment's right to jury trial. Which legal precedent is most relevant? A. Atlas Roofing Company v. Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission, 1977. B. Marbury v. Madison, 1803. C. United States v. Lopez, 1995. D. Chevron U.S. Inc. UDC, 1984. Answer: A. Atlas Roofing Company v. Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission, 1977. Explanation: in Atlas Roofing Company v. Oshus, 1977, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress may allow agencies to impose civil penalties without a jury trial when enforcing public rights. The Seventh Amendment guarantees jury trials in common law cases, but administrative enforcement involves statutory, not common law rights. Thus, agencies can impose civil penalties without violating the Constitution. Thus, option A is correct because Atlas Roofing administrative adjudication without jury trials. Option B is incorrect because Marbury v. Madison established judicial review, not agency adjudication. Option C is incorrect because Lopez addressed Congress's limits under the Commerce Clause, not administrative penalties. Option D is incorrect because Chevron concerns agency statutory interpretation, not adjudication rights. Question 23. Given the impact of federal regulations on small businesses, Congress enacts the Regulatory Flexibility Act (RFA). Which of the following best describes the RFA's purpose? A. To require agencies to consider small business impacts before finalizing regulations. B. To prohibit federal agencies from regulating small businesses. C. To allow small businesses to opt out of federal regulations. D. To grant automatic exemptions from all new federal regulations. Answer: A. To require agencies to consider small business impacts before finalizing regulations. Explanation: the Regulatory Flexibility Act (RFA) requires agencies to analyze the economic impact of proposed regulations on small businesses and consider less burdensome alternatives. Agencies must prepare regulatory flexibility analyses for major rules. Thus, option A is correct because the RFA mandates impact analysis but does not automatically exempt small businesses. Option B is incorrect because the RFA does not prohibit regulation. Option C is incorrect because small businesses cannot opt out of federal regulations. Option D is incorrect because the RFA does not grant automatic exemptions. Question 24. Given the evolving role of administrative law judges as Congress enacts a law requiring Senate confirmation of all newly appointed ALJs, an agency argues that this requirement unconstitutionally infringes on executive power. Which legal doctrine is most relevant in resolving this dispute? A. The Appointments Clause of the Constitution. B. The Unitary Executive Theory limiting agency independence. C. The Chevron Doctrine deferring to agency decisions. D. The Major Questions Doctrine limiting agency rulemaking. Answer A. The Appointments Clause of the Constitution. Explanation. The Appointments Clause, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, governs how federal officials are appointed. It distinguishes between principal officers who must be confirmed by the Senate, e.g. cabinet secretaries, inferior officers whose appointment can be delegated to the president, courts, or department heads. In Lucia v. Sec. 2018, the Supreme Court ruled that ALJs officers are under the Constitution, meaning their appointment must comply with the Appointments Clause. Thus, option A is correct because the Appointments Clause determines whether Senate confirmation is required. Option B is incorrect because the unitary executive theory focuses on the president's removal power, not appointments. Option C is incorrect because Chevron deference applies to statutory interpretation, not constitutional appointments. Option D is incorrect because the Major Questions Doctrine applies to agency rulemaking, not personnel appointments. Question 25. Given the growing role of regulatory enforcement, Congress passes a statute allowing agencies to impose civil penalties without court involvement. A company challenges this law, arguing it violates separation of powers. Which Supreme Court case is most relevant? A. Atlas Roofing Company v. Oshus 1977. B. Marbury v. Madison 1803. C. United States v. Lopez 1995. D. Chevron U.S. A. Inconvert DC 1984. Answer A. Atlas Roofing Company v. Oshus 1977. Explanation. In Atlas Roofing Company v. Oshus 1977, the Supreme Court ruled that agencies can impose civil penalties without court involvement as long as the penalties involve public rights rather than private common law rights. Thus, option A is correct because Atlas Roofing upheld agency enforcement authority. Option B is incorrect because Marbury v. Madison concerns judicial review, not administrative penalties. Option C is incorrect because Lopez dealt with limits on Congress's power under the Commerce Clause, not agency penalties. Option D is incorrect because Chevron concerns agency interpretation of statutes, not their enforcement powers. Question 26. Given concerns about agency independence, Congress proposes limiting the president's power to remove agency heads. Which constitutional principle is most relevant? A. The unitary executive theory affirming presidential control. B. The Commerce Clause regulating economic activity. C. The non-delegation doctrine limiting agency authority. D. The Takings Clause protecting private property. Answer A. The unitary executive theory affirming presidential control. Explanation. The unitary executive theory holds that executive power is fully vested in the president, meaning Congress cannot unduly restrict the president's ability to remove executive officials. In Myers v. United States 1926, the court ruled that Congress cannot limit the president's power to remove purely executive officials. In Sealer Lawyer CAB 2020, the court held that independent agencies cannot be completely shielded from presidential control. Thus, option A is correct because the unitary executive theory affirms presidential control over agency officials. Option B is incorrect because the Commerce Clause regulates economic activity, not executive authority. Option C is incorrect because the non-delegation doctrine applies to legislative delegation, not executive removal power. Option D is incorrect because the Takings Clause concerns government seizure of property, not agency independence. Question 27. Given the expanding scope of federal regulatory agencies, Congress enacts a statute requiring that all major agency rules receive explicit congressional approval before taking effect. An agency challenges this requirement, arguing that it unconstitutionally restricts executive authority. Which Supreme Court case is most relevant in resolving this dispute? A. Ins v. Chadha 1983. B. Chevron U. S. A. Inc. ADC 1984. C. United States. B. Nixon 1974. D. Gibbons v. Ogden 1824. Answer: A. Inns v. Chadha 1983. Explanation: in Inns v. Chadha 1983, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress cannot reserve the power to unilaterally overturn executive actions without following the constitutional legislative process, i.e., bicameralism and presentment. The court struck down the legislative veto ruling that Congress cannot directly override agency decisions without passing a new law signed by the president. A requirement that agencies seek congressional approval before issuing rules is similar to a legislative veto, making it constitutionally suspect under Chadha. Thus, option A is correct because Inns v. Chadha prevents Congress from controlling agencies on legislative means. Option B is incorrect because Chevron deals with agency interpretation of statutes, not Congress's power over rulemaking. Option C is incorrect because United States v. Nixon involves executive privilege, not agency rulemaking. Option D is incorrect because Gibbons v. Ogden is about the Commerce Clause, not separation of powers. Question 20. Given growing concerns about executive overreach, Congress enacts a law allowing state governments to challenge federal agency rules before they take effect. A state challenges an EPA regulation under this new law. EPA argues that the law unconstitutionally expands state power over federal agencies. What is the most likely legal issue in this dispute? A. The Supremacy Clause, ensuring federal law prevails over state challenges. B. The Non-Delegation Doctrine, limiting how much power Congress gives states. C. The 10th Amendment, preserving states' rights against federal intrusion. D. The Major Questions Doctrine, restricting agency power in significant areas. Answer: A. The Supremacy Clause, ensuring federal law prevails over state challenges. Explanation: the Supremacy Clause, Article Roman's Clause 2, establishes that federal laws and regulations override conflicting state laws. Courts have ruled that states cannot veto or block federal regulations. Only Congress or the courts can overturn a federal agency rule. Allowing states to preemptively challenge federal rules would likely violate federal supremacy. Thus, option A is correct because the Supremacy Clause prevents states from directly blocking federal regulations. Option B is incorrect because the non-delegation doctrine applies to Congress giving too much power to agencies, not states. Option C is incorrect because the 10th Amendment protects states from federal overreach but does not give them control over federal agencies. Option D is incorrect because the Major Questions Doctrine restricts agency rulemaking but does not address state power over federal regulations. Question 29. Given the increasing reliance on artificial intelligence in regulatory decision-making, Congress establishes new standards for transparency in agency use of AI models. A company argues that an AI-based agency decision violated its due process rights because the AI system's reasoning was not disclosed. Which of the following is the most relevant legal principle in evaluating this claim? A. The Matthews v. Eldridge test for procedural due process. B. The Chevron doctrine, deferring to agency interpretation. C. The Major Questions Doctrine, limiting agency power on significant issues. D. The Rational Basis test, evaluating the reasonableness of regulations. Answer: A. The Matthews v. Eldridge test for procedural due process. Explanation: the Matthews v. Eldridge 1976 test is the key standard for determining whether government procedures satisfy due process requirements. The Supreme Court in Matthews outlined 3 factors to consider: the private interest affected by the decision, e.g., economic penalties, licenses, benefits, the risk of erroneous deprivation due to existing procedures, and the value of additional safeguards, e.g., whether disclosing the AI model would prevent unfair decisions. The government's interest in maintaining efficiency versus the burden of additional procedures. If an agency uses an AI model without explaining its reasoning, courts may find that due process was violated under this framework. Thus, option is correct because Matthews v. Eldridge governs procedural due process challenges. Option B is incorrect because Chevron deference applies to statutory interpretation, not procedural due process. Option C is incorrect because the Major Questions Doctrine limits agencies' ability to regulate significant political issues but does not address procedural due process. Option D is incorrect because the Rational Basis test applies to constitutional challenges to laws, not agency procedures. Question 30. Given the rapid expansion of federal regulatory agencies, Congress enacts a statute requiring all new agency rules to be reviewed by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs (WARA) before implementation. An environmental group challenges this requirement, arguing that it unlawfully delays environmental protections. What is the most likely outcome? A. The requirement is upheld because WARA review is an executive function. B. The court strikes it down as an unconstitutional interference with agency discretion. C. The requirement is invalidated for violating the non-delegation doctrine. D. The challenge is dismissed because WARA lacks independent enforcement authority. Answer: A. The requirement is upheld because WARA review is an executive function. Explanation: the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs (WARA) is part of the Executive Office of the President and reviews significant regulatory actions under Executive Order 12866. Courts have generally upheld WARA review as a legitimate executive oversight function. Agencies remain responsible for rulemaking, but WARA ensures compliance with cost-benefit analysis and statutory requirements. Courts have ruled that executive review does not unlawfully delay protections as long as agencies retain final decision-making authority. Thus, option A is correct because WARA review is an established part of executive oversight. Option B is incorrect because courts recognize the President's authority to oversee executive agencies. Option C is incorrect because the non-delegation doctrine applies to Congress delegating power to agencies, not internal executive review. Option D is incorrect because WARA's lack of enforcement power does not affect its review function.